Okay, we are live. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And before we get started, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of our frontline workers. I know all of our panelists and myself are extremely grateful for the work that you guys are doing. Just so you know as well, there's going to be a Q&A period. This conversation is going to be published on our YouTube channel and also on our podcast, which you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and most other streaming services at the EcoWell podcast. And so this conversation will be exploring misinformation and how we can start to think a bit more critically about it. And with me today are three of my favorite science communicators in Canada. First is Samantha Yammine. She's a neuroscientist, science communicator, and digital media producer. As Science Sam on Instagram, she created space for continued multi way dialogue about science that transcends geographical borders in the traditional gatekeeping of academia. Technical challenges. I don't know how to put Jonathan on the screen, but Jonathan is a science communicator with McGill Office for Science and Society, dedicated to separating sense from nonsense on the scientific stage. With cardiologist Dr. Christopher Labos, he co hosts the award winning medical podcast, The Body of Evidence. And finally, Dr. Ryan Armstrong is a science activist and current executive director of Bad Science Watch, a Canadian nonprofit dedicated to providing analysis to dubious scientific claims to Canadians, our government, and the media, while advocating for strong consumer protection regulations. Thank you, each of you. And my first question, I think a lot of our listeners will be able to think about some of the damaging information related to the coronavirus, but what is the danger of letting wellness and health misinformation run rampant? And maybe we can start with you, Jonathan.
Sure. I'm not sure that I want to go through all of them. I want to leave some for my my fellow panelists. But I mean, let's just start with money, right? I mean, so we don't want to be wasting our money, and a lot of these interventions, these little health products and services, they cost money. So in much the same way that when you're looking to buy a car, you want to make sure that it's a good investment. You're going to go around, you're going to shop, you're going to ask questions, you're going to look for reviews. The same thing should apply to your health interventions if you don't want to be wasting money. And the other thing that I'll say is of course physical harm and even death. That unfortunately does happen. These interventions, even when they are said to be natural, they are not always harmless. Scorpion venom is natural. So just because something is natural does not mean that it's actually harmless. And so there are a lot of these interventions that can cause harm, and there are some that can cause death. For example, I was worked in cancer research for a while, and patients who take alternative or complementary medicine tend to be at a higher risk of dying prematurely from their cancer compared to people who strictly follow the medical regimen. And the reason for that is that if you are not taking the chemotherapy or the radiotherapy or the surgery that is recommended to you and that has been tested and shown to improve survival in this particular case, and you're instead taking something else, then you're not being helped as well as you should. So these are just some of the potential harms of believing things that aren't true in the health sphere.
Ryan, do you want to go next?
Yes, I would love to jump on this. We need like a clicker or something to kind of just buzz in. Yeah, so the obvious harms with misinformation are the immediate risk of those things. Especially when we're talking about like health interventions. What is the risk to the patient from pursuing something that not only wastes their time and money, but also can carry significant risk to their health. Jonathan touched on those things. One of the very much kind of less immediate harms that really I think doesn't get enough focus is the harm of creating the culture of misinformation and the normalization of nonsense. This is something that Tim Caulfield speaks to a bit, but I really think we need to put a lot more attention to this. When we have industries and professions that normalize nonsense and push all kinds of just ridiculous therapies and products onto patients and the public at large, we create, just in addition to the normalization and whatever harms it might have to people's own psyches in not understanding or misunderstanding the world around them and how their body works and how medicine and science works. We're creating populations of people that often mobilize their beliefs politically, and so I really see misinformation, even when we're talking about health misinformation, as undermining our democracy and our ability to collectively determine how to function as a society. Um, just look at the organization that I work with, Bad Science Watch, and some of the stuff that we do. In a perfect world, we wouldn't exist. I wouldn't want to have to do this if I want us to get to a stage where we don't have to exist, because the issues that we go after are just non-issues. So I'd love to be able to put more effort into climate change or other political efforts. It just so happens that I consider myself fairly in tune with the health misinformation world and fairly adept at fighting the battles within it. So that's why I choose to focus on this type of activism. But we exist because this misinformation has become normalized. There are populations of people that have become big advocates for the types of nonsense therapy and beliefs that have been disseminated to them through either their practitioners or things they've seen from the internet. And we also see other nonprofits that pop up that in some cases are funded by different industries that sell very dubious products or services, and these organizations go to bat with us, and I'm sure it's very, very confusing at a political level when policymakers are trying to put their ear to the ground and hear what the public is saying, and they have various groups of nonprofit advocacy organizations all saying different things, and it's these battles that in my ideal world wouldn't have to occur if we didn't have this normalization of misinformation. So that's kind of my broader notion of what the harm can really lead to at a societal level.
Yeah, for me, I think I agree with Jonathan and Ryan that the health impacts that allowing misinformation to run rampant and proliferate everywhere, that can cause real danger to individuals, and that's what primarily motivates me. I want people to be empowered I want people to have the information to be empowered to make the best decisions for their health, whatever that decision ends up being, whether they are trying something experimental that might not have evidence behind it. I don't mind, as long as they're making that decision, they've been empowered to make an informed decision. Everyone has, I believe in patient autonomy. Everyone should be able to make whatever they really feel is best for their mental and physical health. But as long as they're doing it informed and they've not been misinformed and misled, that's where it really can get dangerous. But to me, I also see a greater cultural problem with leaving misinformation unopposed. And that is that kind of the optics of leaving it unopposed, the optics of letting this stuff flourish, especially where I see it most on social media. The dangers of that is that we're telling people that we don't care. And by not acknowledging it, we're telling people that oh, a lot of scientists are like, oh, that's stupid, and we'll just dismiss it, and we won't even engage. And I think it's important that as communicators, we do engage, and we acknowledge the things that people are exploring, because there's a reason why they're exploring it. In a lot of cases, people have felt neglected by by mainstream Western medicine, let's call it. People have felt neglected by institutionalized healthcare and academia, and they've been dismissed. They've had their pain dismissed and discredited, and their experience discredited. That's why they go to places like Goop, because Goop validates their experience. Even when they don't actually have a real solution, they'll at least listen and give that some comfort. And when we leave that unopposed and we don't engage and really listen to the reasons why people are seeking out these alternative options, we're in a way dismissing. And I think that breeds more mistrust and really leads to more othering. And so I think we need to listen better and join in on these conversations, and not always just be shooting down, but listening to the people's motivations for seeking these treatments that are misinformed, yes, but we should listen to why they're doing that, and we should engage, because then we can let people know that we're listening and we care about them, and we can rebuild some of the trust that I think has been damaged from scientists too strongly opposing misinformation and scientists completely dismissing people's experiences over the years.
And maybe one strategy could be regulations and maybe even censorship. You can see this for some of the actions some of the social media platforms have taken specifically about the coronavirus. But this question is dedicated, or for you, Ryan. What are some of the gaps and failings in the way that we are regulating misinformation?
Great question. So it's not quite simple in Canada. We don't have science police, right, that go around and kick down the door of people selling various products as cures to, like COVID-19, for example.
I see a Netflix series in the works, Ryan. Science police.
That's helpful.
I'm excited. Hopefully I can get a role as an executive producer or something.
It's two things people don't like: police and science. I don't know if they both do well. It needs a rebrand.
Yeah, well, that's probably also why we don't have science police, at least not yet. It sounds pretty authoritarian. But instead of having, kind of a universal authority on like matters of science, we have a disparate set of laws and regulatory frameworks that, some are unified across Canada, like the regulation of health products through Health Canada, and some are provincial, like the regulation of health professionals. And they all kind of, recognize the value of science to different extents, and there are certainly, gaps and issues within each of those. It's part of what makes it very difficult as an activist in this area, because there are so many different moving regulatory parts that sometimes it can be hard to keep track of everything and determine, where activism is best placed. But in general, some of the issues are probably one of the biggest challenges that exists today is something certainly that Jonathan has wrestled quite a bit with, and that's in the regulation of products and services from practitioners who might not be regulated at all. So the biggest gap is really just the full gap where someone just might be offering a service without any regulatory authority governing over them. And it's not always really clear what the best approach is there. In really egregious cases, people can be charged with practicing medicine without a license. But in my time as an activist, I haven't really seen that happen.
Very rare.
Very rare. So when we're talking about the regulation of practitioners, it really comes down to the regulating authorities that need to be governing them. And if there is no if there's no authority that someone belongs to, there's no one to stop them from doing what they're doing, or to correct them, or to ensure that they're competent in any way. And so they may very well be breaking all number of laws in terms of false advertising, and certainly practicing medicine without a license. But again, it's a very hard charge to bring forward, and there's no real authority that's going after those types of people. So they may not be the biggest source of misinformation, but at least in the way that our regulatory system is structured, they're probably the biggest gap. Other than that, one of the big issues.
Can I jump in on that before we move on?
Absolutely.
I just wonder if even if it were enforced to take down certain things, I wonder if that would even help. Like, I wonder if regulation is really even going to be that helpful. We saw with coronavirus as an example, some people have, YouTube has been taking down videos that are promoting the idea that 5G causes coronavirus or whatever. So videos have been taken down, and if anything, I think that bolsters people's passion about them. So I wonder if regulation, do you even think regulation could achieve, close that gap, or is that just going to make people more passionate about the cause?
I think it absolutely can.
Sorry to derail.
No, that's a great question. It's a very important question. Obviously, when people see certain types of regulation that they think is very authoritative, it's very often framed as censorship, right? I mean, that's a very common motif in the anti-vax community. Anytime and anyone really pushes back on anti-vax messaging or anything that their hero practitioners are doing, it's called out as censorship, which is a really powerful kind of battle cry these days. So I think there's an important distinction to be made between regulating people acting in like regulated marketplaces, so selling certain products, selling services, compared to just people putting up their own, YouTube videos or sharing information on social media. I'm not really sure what the answer is in terms of regulating the type of misinformation that's coming from people who don't have, a clear financial incentive, who are just kind of, engaging in their free speech and sharing their ideas. But I think absolutely there's a role for effective regulation when we're looking at people who are making a living doing so, and they're bound by the law to advertise products, without false or misleading information. This is another point that a number of organizations that act in opposition to what we do often bring up. They say that regulatory reform is going to take people's products away or limit what kind of services they can get. And that's never been our mission. That's never been my personal mission in what I do. I don't want anyone to not be able to get essential oils. I have essential oils. I don't want people to be misled.
You're also selling them. You're selling them for the trunk of your car as well, which is important to mention.
Actually, we're down to one car right now, so I go around on my bike and I
call the number at the bottom of your screen right now.
Act fast. The deal is running out. So it's I think it's it's not something that we want to have people to limit everyone's options and what they can pursue, but I don't think it's too much to ask for honest advertising, and when medical and health claims are made, I think they should make they should meet a certain criteria that is universal. I think it's not too much to demand evidence to back up claims when products are being sold, and especially when we have healthcare practitioners who are who benefit financially from the services that they sell, and they're pushing patients in a certain direction. They shouldn't be able to tell their patients that their services, which may be complete nonsense, may boost their immune system, for example. And I don't think by stopping them from saying that is going to really lead to a lot of backlash, because we're not taking away the service, we're not taking away the product, we're just kind of enforcing universal standards. And especially if we can put forward those types of standards and unify them across our various disparate regulatory authorities, and make it very clear and transparent, I don't think there's any foul that anyone can cry. But of course, we're very far off from that, because again, we have all of these different regulatory authorities, and they all have their own agendas, and many of them are really more in the fringe areas of science, and a lot of the regulatory authorities of professions that have maybe more pseudoscientific histories to them, or certain philosophies that are pervasive across their practitioners. Those same types of practitioners tend to hold authority at the regulatory colleges, and as a result, since they're the authority of what is a valid practice in terms of the diagnostics and therapeutics that are offered, it is very hard to actually get the colleges to take any action on blatant misinformation.
Well, also there's direct-to-consumer marketing that's international.
And when I say blatant misinformation, there is a lot of it out there. Yeah, international issues is a whole other ballgame, and that's something that Health Canada, I know, certainly struggles with when we're talking about online retailers and the like. So yeah, I mean, they're all different regulatory frameworks, and it's not really clear what the right way forward is right now. But what we're kind of doing at the ground level as activists is we're going after the misinformation that does exist, at least the really egregious cases, and we're submitting complaints and hoping that the colleges act on those, and as they should. And if they don't, then we'll have evidence that they're failing in their duties, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, and I think maybe just like brushing up or brushing on some of the regulations for specific products for claims. So for like drug products, I mean, my expertise is in cosmetics, so that's all I'll speak to. If you make a drug claim, you have to have your product approved as a drug, and that requires a amount of evidence to support it. I mean, that is to demonstrate, I mean, efficacy for one, but also safety. You want to make sure that these products are safe. So, a concern of mine for some of the internal products, the natural health supplements or supplements in the United States, is kind of a scary thing to me. Sometimes they don't have those basic safety tests that they, from my vantage, probably should have if they're making certain claims. And then for health claims online, some of them can have really damaging impacts. And Samantha brought this up, the idea that information censorship might even amplify the message. Jonathan, you tagged me on a post like a week ago about it. Just one example where censorship from YouTube made a difference. Do you want to take us through that case and maybe share your thoughts on that? Information censorship, or should we just let it be on the internet, or should we try to actually do something with censoring it? Sorry for my poorly formed question.
Yeah, can you refresh my mind on which example that was?
This was about a Quebec, I believe, based naturopath who was sharing information on her YouTube channel, and then after YouTube,
there's a further twist of the story. So yeah, I mean the point that we were circling around, which is this idea of censoring people on social media, on the internet, when they're making claims that are wrong and that can be harmful. It's a very, very tricky question, and I'm definitely no expert on it, because one of the arguments that I've heard is, well, the best thing you can do against the bad idea is to give a better idea, right? So just confront them with your arguments, and the best argument will win. And unfortunately, that's a very naive take on the situation. In science communication, we used to have this idea of the information deficit model, which is that people who disagree with the scientific consensus on an issue, they do so because they're lacking information. So our role as communicators is to come in, give them more information, the correct information, the scientific information, and then people will realize, oh, I was wrong, and they will agree with the scientific consensus. And while this does occur for certain topics, for others, topics that inform somebody's identity, topics that are very close to the core of who people are, topics that are very emotional, it doesn't work, right? Because your brain acts like a lawyer, and it decides it's going to defend your belief to the death, no matter what contradictory information you hear. So this idea that somebody posts something on Facebook that is wrong, and the only thing that we need to do is to come in with the right information in the comment section, and that's going to solve the problem, that's unfortunately that's naive, right? So what do you do?
I would never suggest that.
No, I was not responding specifically to what you said, but just the broader debate over what do we do with misinformation online, right? So then we come to censorship. Like, should we use censorship or not? And I don't have a fully developed opinion on this, but I do think that in the case of vaccine misinformation, I do think that censorship has a role to play, because in this particular case, we know very clearly that childhood vaccinations are safe. Asterisk, nothing is 100% safe. We know what the side effects are. They're very, very rare. And we also know that misinformation can cause direct harm to children. And we've debunked these arguments over and over again. And we know that they're having an effect on vaccination rates, which have really decreased significantly in many countries. So because all of these elements are present, I would say, yes, in this particular case, I'm all for censoring clearly, misleading and wrong vaccine, misinformation. But in other cases, like with COVID-19, for example, the science of it is evolving so quickly. What do you do with this? I mean, somebody was arguing with me that we need to make it a crime for somebody to spread misinformation about COVID-19. It's like, well, who decides what is misinformation about COVID-19? I mean, yeah, there are things that are clearly way out there. There are Alex Jones territory, but then there are things where it's unclear, and so it can be very difficult to decide what to do with this. However, I do think that some amount of censorship can make a difference, and there is the case of one naturopath, and even that I use a term loosely because she got her diploma from a diploma mill online, but she goes around, being a naturopath and doing consults and talking about what she has learned, which is complete misinformation. This is somebody who thinks that cancer is a good thing because it's an indicator that your body is too acidic, so you just need to alkalinize your body and you'll be fine. She thinks she can cure the Ebola virus and HIV with colloidal silver. She has a number of clearly nonsensical, unscientific ideas, and she was spouting them on her YouTube channel. Was very, very successful at it. Some of her videos reached close to 1 million views. And at some point, she got into trouble with YouTube because YouTube decided they had so much pressure about the miracle mineral supplement and certain kinds of clearly harmful health misinformation that was circulating on their platforms, that they really they really took some measures to block these videos. And so she went from having a large audience on YouTube to losing a good chunk of that audience and having to post her videos on BitChute. And when you go to BitChute and you look at how many people are viewing her videos, it's like 60 people, 70 people, right? So we've gone from hundreds of thousands of people who are exposed to this to 60, 70 people, because now people are no longer stumbling upon her stuff because YouTube is so well used. It's used by so many people. People were just stumbling on this stuff and going down the rabbit hole. So I do think that there is, even though there's, we think that if you do this, these people will become empowered, they will want to fight harder. The good side of this is that fewer and fewer people in the middle will be exposed to this kind of misinformation and will fall for it because they might lack some knowledge of science to realize that this is wrong. So there's no good solution to this, but I think that in specific cases, censorship can work.
Does anyone want to chime in before we move on to our next question?
Sure. After you.
I would just wonder, it's completely anecdotal, but I noticed that those types of videos that get taken off YouTube, I end up getting sent them through WhatsApp. And the really tricky thing about wanting to take stuff down is that we forget that there are really powerful one-to-one types of platforms like WhatsApp that have, in the hundreds of millions of monthly active users, if not over 1 billion. I forget what the numbers are. But so I feel like they get moved into these more direct forms of social media, like WhatsApp, WeChat, all that. And it'd be really hard to take stuff off of those social media platforms because people view them as very personal, and it'd be a big scandal and super invasive. WhatsApp's trying to limit how much you can forward videos around, but I would just be curious. She's probably not getting a lot of views on BitChute, but I bet she's getting shared a lot on WhatsApp and places like that. And so that's where it gets so tough, is that I think censorship will always enrage people. And that's where I think, and I agree that commenting is just, no one sees your comment on a popular video or post anyway. Like, it's just not effective to argue in comments. But I really think the answer is going to come through grassroots, like cultural shifts, grassroots, and really reaching more people and looking at those communities who are more passionate about the misinformation channels and thinking of how we can deliver engaging science communication, how we can actually engage them and have multi-directional conversations with those communities. I feel like we're neglecting, these things are proliferating amongst communities that are being neglected by the traditional forms of science communication. And if we can tap into create content by and for those communities being neglected, I think that would drive some cultural shifts that would be much more effective, in my opinion, than taking stuff down. But it's all speculation here. I'm just guessing.
Very, very good point.
Yeah, I think we're all really speculating and going on our intuition with this, right? It's very complicated. It's very complicated to even think of how we would begin to study this phenomena, especially when we're dealing with all of these very unique cases. The other example that came to mind for me was, of course, Alex Jones, who's been demonetized from platforms, and of course, I don't know of all of the data where I would even begin to look to get an idea of his audience base and how he's doing, and all of the various factors that impact his platform and his kind of media monstrosity generally. Although I think the censorship in his case has at least put a bit of a damper on the spread of his misinformation. But yeah, I mean, even in that case, it's really difficult to determine. Of course, the other big question is, do we really want social media platforms being arbiters of science? That also remains an open question. I think in a very distant area of censorship that, of course, is hotly debated on social media right now, of censoring like racism and fascist sentiments. I think there's a very good case to be made there to make platforms safer. I think there's good evidence to support censorship in those areas. I think it's a little bit more complicated with science, and yeah, obviously the big question on everyone's mind always is, if we don't want the social media platforms to be in charge of this process, what is the next step? And I don't think it's been satisfactorily answered at this point.
And taking a step back, this question is for you, Jonathan. What are some of the human problems with identifying what's correct?
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as I can, because this is, I mean, we're opening up a huge meal there. So the problem is this: it's our brain, the little squishy thing inside of our skull, because it's not a computer, and it has evolved in ways it has adapted to make sure that we can survive, but it's not perfect, and sometimes it can lead us astray. We're talking a little bit about conspirational thinking. I mean, Alex Jones is a prime example of that. It is easy for our brain to see conspiracies even where there are none. And part of that is because our brain has evolved to seek patterns and to recognize patterns even where there are none, and also to find agents even where there are none. So the classic example is, you're an early human in the savannah of Africa, and you hear rustling in the bush. What is it? Is it the wind? Is it a big cat? And so in order for you to survive, I mean, the people who survived the best were probably those where their brain told them it was a lion, even when it was the wind, because then, even if it is the wind, you still survive, but vice versa, it doesn't work so well. So we have these predispositions to see things where there are none. I mean, I'm reminded of the face on Mars, when we got that photo from the Viking probe in the 70s, it looked like there was a human face on Mars, because your brain seeks faces everywhere when you're a baby. What comes with food and with sustenance, it's your mom. It's two dots and a dash, right? It's a face. So we see faces everywhere. We think there are agents everywhere, and that can lead us to think that there are conspiracies where there are none. Another way in which our brain kind of misfires is the availability heuristic. So heuristics are these shortcuts that your brain takes because you can't spend hours and hours debating things. Sometimes you have to make a quick decision. And so we have these shortcuts that are quite good, but they're not perfect. And so if you're watching the news and if you're hearing about murders, because murders are they're dramatic, and so reporters love to cover them. And if I then ask you, what is the most common type of criminal activity, was it the most common type of crime, your brain might go, okay, what comes to mind immediately? And if you've just heard about murders, you might think to yourself, oh, it must be murders. And of course, murder is not the most common type of crime. But again, it's this availability heuristic. What is clearly and very quickly available to your brain will lead you to think that that's the answer. And something else, the more you repeat something, the more likely you are to think it's true. So if we keep talking about these myths that we're debunking and we mention them again and again and again, for some people, they might forget that they are not true, but they might simply remember the thing that we were talking about. Oh yeah, I heard this thing about 5G and COVID-19. I forget what was said, but there was a link. There was something there. And perhaps the biggest flaw in our brain is confirmation bias, right? So if you have a belief that you cherish, you're more likely to go seek out information that will reinforce that belief than to seek out information that will disconfirm it. So as an author once mentioned, we're not rational animals. We're rationalizing animals. We come to conclusions and we often go backwards and we try to figure out reasons for why we arrived at this particular conclusion. And just to wrap this up, I mean, the reason why we do science in the first place is to get around that, right? It's because our brain, our intuitions, they're not perfect. So science is just a set of tools and techniques and methodologies to reduce the degree to which we are wrong, to make sure we are as objective as we can be, to make sure that we're only studying this one variable that we're interested in. And so by doing science, we can improve our thinking and basically have a better way of identifying what is true versus what is false.
Something that I personally see as a challenge is a lot of the people that get a massive platform have no idea what they're talking about, and it's really hard for the general public, especially if they don't have specific expertises in X area. It's really hard for the general public to know the difference. Perhaps before you stop talking, would you mind taking us through the Dunning-Kruger effect?
Sure. So there's a phenomenon in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect, by which when you're not an expert in something, it is easy for you to think that you know more than you actually do. And sometimes that translates into people who have no expertise whatsoever in something, thinking that they know more than the experts. And so the Dunning-Kruger effect is not something that affects idiots. It's something that affects all of us. We all have this predisposition to this particular effect, because when you don't know anything about a topic, it may look very simple superficially. And then you start to dig in and you realize, oh, this is a lot more complicated than I thought it would be. And so, I mean, having gone through grad school and university, the same thing happened to me. Like in the beginning, genetics may look very simple. And sometimes a question that I get is, well, none of my parents have this, but I do. How can this be genetic? Because people have this idea that genetic means that every person in every generation will have it, will express it. But when you are studying genetics, you realize, no, it is very complicated. There are different modes of inheritance. There's penetrance. There's epigenetics. It's very, very complex. So the more you know about a topic, as is commonly said, the more you realize how little you know about it. But when you know nothing about a topic, it may actually look quite simple, and it may embolden you to have strong opinions about this because you think you know more than you actually do.
What's very interesting about the original, Dunning-Kruger study compared to how the context in which we're examining it now. If I remember correctly, it was looking at university level test takers and their results of a test compared to their confidence, going into that examination. That's essentially that's still, a level playing field. There's no there are no feedback loops. Subjects go in, they estimate how proficient they are. They take their test, they get the result. We see that some people who score very well have underestimated how well they were going to perform, and some people who have scored very poorly have vastly overestimated their ability because they just don't know what they don't know. What's really interesting with social media now is I think we have an even kind of worse amplification, because now we have people with very huge followers, followings, thousands of people that are supporting them and amplifying their messages. And I would love to know what the impact of that is on this type of effect, and how people with large platforms perceive their proficiency and just in really just understanding the subjects that they're tweeting about.
Yeah, and if I may just very quickly say, ignorance is often not what we think of it. It's not that your mind is empty on a topic, is that you have misinformation in your brain. You think you have something that is true, but you don't, and that's quite dangerous.
I will just say, I think what's difficult is people with these large followings, what they're good at, the reason that the data that we ignore is the fact that they have a large platform means that they are really good at connecting with people. And that's something that I wish that scientists and science communicators learned from influencers on social media. These people are experts at connecting with people. And so the challenge is it's not often their job to research everything that they're saying, because people follow them for their free form of consciousness and yeah, these are my thoughts and opinions, and I think they should have a responsibility to use that platform in a certain way. But really, I don't know that there's so much mindfulness going on in what they're saying. I think that's just what they've been selected to do. That's why people follow them, is that they're just kind of saying things as they come to mind and moving on. And so that's where the challenge comes in, is because not everyone is going to put in that thought. Not everyone, I think, is even considering themselves as an expert. It's just when you have a platform, your reaction is, I should comment on this because that's what you do. So yeah, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect with like influencers, let's say, or people with large platforms is interesting, because you don't always really realize that there are actually other people taking in the information.
But I would argue that even
Yeah.
Even if we learn from celebrities, and I do think there is something to be learned from influencers on how to be authentic and how to approach people, how to be, how to be the kind of person that other people want to see. We also have this added challenge, which is that they can give you very simple but wrong answers to complicated questions. And as scientists and science communicators, we have to come in with a lot of nuance and complexities. And so that does not always translate as well. It's not always as smooth to communicate. It's not always as easy to communicate as a celebrity that just goes, this thing causes that, the end. So we have this added level of complexity, unfortunately.
This is why I'm a big proponent of regulatory activism, going after regulators, going after politicians. Listen, you guys have to listen to us. We're submitting complaints. It's not about we're not looking at just validation from followers. It's a very different ball game. It's like convincing the public on something versus convincing someone whose job it is to investigate the truth of something is very different. There are certainly different strategies there. I'm certainly, I hope, more proficient in the latter. I don't think I have a huge reach over social media, especially
Ryan,
with younger demographics.
I see guitars behind you. I think you have a future. You could be an influencer.
Maybe I'll get back into it. Maybe I'll get TikTok.
The one you should. It's so much fun. The one challenge here is politicians and regulatory bodies are bound to do what their stakeholders, i.e., the voting population, want on the whole. Like, that's the definition of democracy. So at the end of the day, you still need to be convincing the masses, and that's what people online with large platforms are really, really good at, is engaging the masses and getting those numbers. And I think that's kind of our challenge there, is how can we make ourselves available and have conversations with people with those platforms to get them to think a little bit more, like, maybe you shouldn't comment on this, or maybe you should share this different source. And I kind of went on a tangent from Dunning-Kruger effect, but it was just the thought that I had. I just felt bad that we're kind of saying this, it's just tough, because they are really, really good at some things, and that's what they're prioritizing. And so it's a lot to now ask them to do something in addition to their job, which is have burden of proof all the time. It's I don't know.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's important to convince the public as well, and then it would be nice if we, as everyone who's an activist in this space, going to regulators and going to politicians, if we also, didn't have to fight against members of the public who have been misinformed, that would make it much easier for us. So, I mean, the battle being waged on every front is certainly important for misinformation.
Yeah. Many approaches are needed.
Well, and something else is like a beauty bias. And so people who are more attractive their message is often better received to the public. There was a survey a few years ago that surveyed Americans to see who their most trusted sources of information were. And it was mostly celebrities. I don't think there was a scientist on the top 10, and I believe Tom Hanks was number one. A Nobel laureate was like 16 or something like that. Do you guys want to?
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen a lot of data sets on public perceptions of science in a lot of studies, and I don't know how much that holds. I think so, like Ontario Science Center and then the 3M State of Science Index, which I have a conflict of interest to declare. I work with them to promote this survey, so that's my conflict. But yeah, in both of their surveys of international and specifically Canadian populations, people do hold the highest level of trust in scientists and scientific institutions, and then science centers come a little bit further down. And so
Was that a survey in
typically
Canada?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Is that based off of the Canadian public?
And the 3M State of Science Index is international.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it comes down to how you ask the question. Like, I think the question in the surveys I'm referring to was, where do you go for science information, or who do you trust? Who do you have the greatest deal of confidence in? Is another way. There's been Pew Research Center, I think, has a lot of questions where they ask, like, what level of confidence do you have in these different institutions? And scientists rank pretty high. Like, we have a pretty good trust score. I think it's more celebrities are more available and have higher reach and all that. But
yeah, I agree, because that is a point that I also make, because a lot of people think, oh, we're living this anti-science age. No, we're not.
Yeah.
Trust in scientists is very high. However, big star asterisk, which is that there are certain issues where there is a gap between what the public believes and what the scientific consensus is. I'm thinking of genetically engineered food, for example, vaccinations in certain segments of the population. So yeah, overall trust in scientists is quite high, which is reassuring. But there are specific issues where the public says, no, I'm not going to trust a scientist on this one for some reason.
And I think it typically ends up, in my experience, it's often the issues where there is a social component to it, and the scientists kind of like to say, no, we don't need to talk about the impact racism has had in this realm of research, or we don't need to talk about this scandal. Like, whenever there's like a social component to it, or it has to do with, I think scientists tend to say, like, let's just not talk about that, and that's where people say, well, that's why I'm not trusting the scientists on this one. I think that's a little bit at play.
Yeah, science certainly has a rough history in social areas, and I mean that's, I think, largely a function of science as an institution, because it is an institution of people with its own biases and
Ryan, is that a copy of the bell curve that I see behind you?
Oh no, you won't find that one over here. But we're not going down that rabbit hole. But I think certainly people recognize science as a framework and methodology for understanding the world. I think people respect that, at least conceptually, at least aesthetically. So if you ask someone, if you ask the population, do you believe in science? I'm not sure what the current polling results would be, but I highly doubt that there would be many people saying no to that. Obviously,
quite high.
Yeah, quite high. As Jonathan alluded to, it's the specific scientific issues that seem to be the problem, where and perhaps a distrust of certain scientists and maybe certain kind of popular figures of science. Bill Gates, for example, right now seems to be just surrounded by a cloud of misinformation, and I think there's certainly an amount of distrust that's warranted. He's a billionaire after all, and we can talk about the social issues and implications there. But with his more mainstream kind of scientific pursuits, I think a lot of his efforts are generally laudable. But the absolute misinformation that surrounds him is remarkable.
Sam, my next question is to you. What are some of the metrics to look to when determining if a source is credible, and some of the tools or resources to sift through some of the information out there?
That's a toughie. I think I want to start with maybe not so much metrics, but a little checklist of things to look out for. I think if you're reading something online, for example, and it's referencing a new study, I think the first thing you should look for is, have they really referenced the study and have they linked to it? So if you're reading a blog article and they haven't linked to the new study directly that they're talking about, I think that's a bit of a red flag. Anyone who's done the research or is an experienced spreader would link to the actual source. So I think if there's no actual source linked or explicitly mentioned, I think that's a pretty big red flag. And then I would encourage you to actually click that source. And even if you don't, the technical jargon of that study is over your head, which it often is when we're reading outside of our field, so it's normal. But just get a sense of what the study actually said. Like just skim it and just see, oh, okay, it seems like this is very specific. Look at who the study was on. Was it on mice? Was it on humans? Was it on 10 humans? And were all of those humans like cis white men? Keep those things. Really look at the demographics of the study and the scope of the study. And you can just skim and do that pretty quickly. Even if you don't like reading science papers, that's okay. But I think that'll just help you to really see the scope of it. And if the person that you're getting information from isn't mentioning those kinds of limitations, isn't mentioning like who was the study done on and what did they actually test, and if they're not being clear, then I would really, really take caution in trusting what they're saying. The other really big thing is the source that you're learning from okay with being wrong? Are they dealing in absolutes and saying this is true, this is true? And if someone opposes them, are they engaging or are they blocking them? Are they deleting them? Are they, never admitting to making a mistake? To me, the people I trust the most when I'm learning about things outside of my area of expertise is that person willing to learn? Are they willing to have conversation? And if they're not, then I think you should really be hesitant about trusting them as a source, because science is all about, and life is all about learning and reiterating and going again and trying again. And none of us are experts in anything except our own experiences. And even that we're not that great at being experts in because we have memory failures and biases and stuff. So I think just anyone who's not willing to be corrected, you want to be super, super careful. In terms of tools, my favorite tool, because I'm a scientist on social media and that's my jam, would be I like using social media as a way of learning. And I like to follow experts in different fields, whether that be actual activists studying social sciences and stuff like that, or it's epidemiologists right now. Follow a lot of people who are leaders in that field. And you can do that pretty easily by looking up like hashtag astronaut, hashtag epidemiology, or hashtag this is what a scientist looks like. Following those things and just starting to expose yourself and get used to seeing the way that those experts are talking, I think is a really helpful tool that over time will get you used to the kind of language that someone who's a little more cautionary and trustworthy would use, and that will help you shift your standards, just saying, oh yeah, maybe it is weird that this person's always so sure that this thing causes cancer and this thing doesn't. Maybe it's a little weird because none of the cancer researchers I follow talk like that. So I think that's one of the really big tools that you can use. I know there are some fact-checking websites. I don't know if anyone else can comment on those. Those I know less about. My biggest tool is experts on social media and clicking the source and seeing what it's like.
Certainly for me, one of my go-to strategies when I'm facing new information or a new topic is definitely that chain of trust, right? Going to people that I know are very thorough. They have the experience and tend to, or at least try to do their best in breaking down a topic and the science behind it. So, I mean, if anyone who hops on Twitter and surely tweets at any of us, I'm sure we can make our own recommendations of who to follow and for what. I won't mention any names here, but there are lots of great people out there in all kinds of different fields, and building that chain of trust is really essential, especially when I don't understand something, or if I see a claim and I think, oh, someone must have debunked this before, and so I search across the usual suspects, and typically I'll find something. The other thing that I'd like to point out that really is a common issue on the regulatory side of things when analyzing the validity of different claims and trying to assess the quality of the resources and the studies behind those, it comes up over and over again, the important distinction between basic science and clinical science. And of course, this is something that we've all encountered and probably written on and read ad nauseum. But there's a difference between testing some kind of compound on cancer cells in a petri dish and testing that same compound when given, let's say, intravenously into a living person. The human body is very complex, and clinical trials are really what let us determine what therapeutics and diagnostics are valid. And really, for a lot of the claims out there that are nonsense, they just don't have any, of course, clinical science backing them up. And so I think anything without that type of data, people should be very skeptical of. One example that I've started using now, the classic example, of course, is the bleach as a cancer cure, right? Bleach kills cancer cells in a petri dish, but you shouldn't drink bleach. Unfortunately, some people do that as a therapy. That's a whole other domain of nonsense that we're not going to get into. But another analogy that I've come up with that I use a lot when we're talking about, especially looking at like certain vitamins or compounds that people say will like boost the immune system, or well, let's look at the example of vitamin D, for example. Vitamin D, there are many claims for immune boosting properties. There really isn't strong evidence to back that up in a lot of cases, even though vitamin D is known to play a role in the immune system. But the analogy I would use is bricks are known to play a role in the building of houses and the strength of houses. But throwing a brick at your house does not make your house stronger, right? So that's the difference between the basic science, understanding that some compound is maybe a component in a greater structure. That being the reality does not mean that consuming that is going to provide linear benefits or any benefits at all. Of course, there are all kinds of different aspects that we would want to look into when we're performing clinical trials beyond just is there a therapeutic effect, but certainly there should be some level of clinical evidence, or at least clinical safety of interventions. Another thing I see a lot of are claims derived from basic science that say, well, we performed this one intervention, and in this small study, we saw a difference in these certain biomarkers. And there's just kind of this assumption often that those differences seen are a good thing, even though we don't know whether there is a clinical, meaningful difference in whatever, condition or disease is intended to be treated. So that's my point broadly, is clinical science is very important for clinical claims, and the evidence should be there when practitioners are making promises to patients.
Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. I would add two things. The first is, if you see somebody making the point, try it. What do you have to lose? Just try it. You won't know until you've tried it. This is a very pernicious argument that you hear a lot with pseudosciences. This idea that your personal experience will tell you if this thing works or not. Unfortunately, that's not really a good gauge of whether or not an intervention does work, because there's so many other things that are happening at the same time. You don't know, you might have gotten better on your own without taking this thing. But that is an argument that carries a lot of weight by people who don't care too much about the science and who want to sell you things that don't work. The second thing that I want to say is, all of these tips are very good, but pseudoscience has gotten very good at providing the kinds of pieces of evidence that we skeptics have been asking for a while. And so you see more and more systematic reviews of things that don't work saying that they do work. You see more and more meta-analyses apparently showing a positive result. So there is this pyramid of evidence that we often talk about, where we have at the very top systematic reviews and meta-analyses. These are ways for scientists to look at all of the evidence and to really systematize and come up with an answer from all of the studies that have been done. And more I am being sent these meta-analyses on bogus therapies that come to a positive result. But when you look at the studies that go inside the meta-analysis, these are all terrible studies that are deeply, deeply flawed. And so it's this principle of garbage in, garbage out. So if you put garbage inside of a meta-analysis, you're going to get garbage out of it. But unfortunately, pseudoscientists have gotten very good at blinding with science, at giving you the kinds of papers that scientists have been asking for with positive results to make it look like their thing is working. So it can actually be quite hard to figure out what works and what doesn't work in that kind of environment.
Mm-hmm. I will just say, to follow up on some of the stuff that we've said, the placebo effect is real. As we said, if someone's telling you try something, it can't hurt and you'll know for yourself. My philosophy is like a placebo effect can be significant, especially when it comes to things related to like stress, anxiety, or pain. Sometimes placebos can be really helpful as long as that placebo isn't causing harm. And so that's really what my threshold is. Like, I don't mind if I use a face mask every night and it's not gonna like make me look perfect, but it makes me feel really good. And for me, that's enough. I don't really care, but I agree that as soon as the claim is being like is becoming a really strong selling factor, and especially when it can be dangerous. A mask isn't too dangerous, but in most cases, but putting something in your mouth could be really dangerous. Putting a collagen supplement in your mouth, that could become dangerous. And so that's where I think we have to hold the standards highest, is when the claim actually has potential negative effect, like negative health outcome. That's where I get scared. Otherwise, I don't mind the placebo. I think that they're pretty great.
And so my last question before we open up to Q&A from our audience, instead of just preaching to the choir, as I find sometimes we do online, how can we as science communicators reach the people who actually need this information? For example, for the people who are at home gargling bleach, how do we get the information to them?
Can I start? Because
Yes.
this is my job. so my full-time job is this type of science marketing, I guess you could call it. The number one critique that I get is, aren't you just preaching for the choir because social media algorithms are really echo chambers? And this can be true, especially if you're using social media kind of casually and you're just tweeting and hoping people see it. Same thing's true if you host an in-person event. The people who are going to come to a science event are probably people who are interested in science. The way that you reach new audiences is by having strategy and by making content that those new audiences actually want. The thing we talk about, the deficit model as being dead in science communication, but are we still just deciding what people need to know, or are we actually listening to them and seeing what they want to know and seeing where their curiosities lie? So like using Google Trends, for example, to look into what questions people currently have about COVID-19. That's in part how we should be framing the topics that we discuss, talking about what people are curious in. And of course, sprinkling in the context people may not know they don't know, and that is an important add-on. But really looking at what people care about. And then the marketing strategy. This is a $1 billion industry on social media marketing. It's a huge industry. It's how, all successful e-commerce businesses market. And the way that they get new customer penetration, new audience penetration, is by appealing to those customers using search engine optimization, or SEO, but for each specific social media platform. So that means hashtagging in really creative ways. If you're Jen and you're trying to myth-bust something about the beauty industry, your picture better look like a beauty blogger's picture. That's how you reach that audience. You have to make your content look and feel like what your target audience is already looking for. And you have to use their hashtags, you have to use their words. If you're out there posting about coronavirus and you're only calling it COVID-19, well, a lot of people colloquially just call it corona or call it coronavirus, and that's it. And so you should be hashtagging with all of those common search terms and engaging with those communities, engaging and reaching out. That's how you reach the audiences. Because it can be an echo chamber, but with strategy that is robust and exists and has lots of data behind it, you can reach new audiences. And there's lots of data for this that I could share if someone's really curious, and some of my own data as well, showing that a lot of my posts are reaching like 50% of people who don't follow me, lots of people who've never seen my content before. New people are seeing it all the time. And, people interacting one-on-one that you might not see if you look at my page, for example, are different than those commenting publicly. Lots of data.
So I might be the odd one out, but I don't really consider myself a science communicator, maybe only a science communicator as kind of a side effect of what I do. although I mean, I certainly do communicate science to an extent. But you know, I'm not huge on social media. I'm not trying to really reach the public that hard. I am really all about the echo chamber. The echo chamber is my jam. But
I
there,
love that.
there's a reason though. I have a purpose. Sorry, my cat is out of control here. I you know, what I try to do is reach out to like-minded people and people who are, you know, interested in you know, battling this type of misinformation, who, you know, might be could be mobilized into acting themselves, you know, into learning what kind of mechanisms are available for them at a regulatory level, and to, you know, I hope to empower people, either, you know, if not to get involved with an organization or an advocacy effort in this space, if then just to, you know, do their own thing, and, you know, if they come across misinformation, to report it, and to be, you know, to have the knowledge of what you know, tools and approaches to go for. And in addition, I've been trying to, you know, document my own journey and my own approaches, and I'm really trying to figure out, by doing battle with our regulatory systems, you know, what works, what is effective, and what tools can interested parties, whether that is, you know, activists like myself, or patients who have been harmed by misinformation, you know, what can we do to best spend our time to seek justice, essentially, and to see regulatory authorities function as they should. So that's my note on this topic. I'm a man of the echo chamber, but I do really appreciate everyone who works to engage the public and educate them. I don't think I'm quite as effective in that area.
You know, I briefly mentioned the skeptics and the skeptical movement. I mean, there's a fairly long history of people in that movement, quote unquote, debunking this kind of misinformation. But there's a problem that has emerged over the years, which is that skeptics are often perceived as being arrogant and as being dismissive. And so I think, as to echo something that Sam was saying earlier, I think that we need to bring in more compassion and more empathy when we're doing this. We need to listen to people, and we need to build trust, which is not easy, because the platforms that we have access to online tend to be these one-way platforms, where you're making a video, you're not having a dialogue with someone. I think a live stream like this, where we're taking questions, brings us at least one step closer to having a real dialogue. But it can be hard to really listen to people, build that relationship of trust, as opposed to just looking like somebody who is, you know, spewing, debunking information online. And the last thing that I'll say is that, you know, we've come down pretty hard on preaching to the choir, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because that choir has colleagues and friends and relatives that we can't reach directly. So when we are informing the people who naturally turn to us, they can then turn around and share that information with people who trust them. So hopefully the information doesn't just stay within our echo chamber, but that can actually move beyond it, and get shared to other people that we cannot reach directly.
And that's why I really like Instagram as a platform, because one, it's a platform where you can have a lot of two-way dialogue. So you can have comments that everyone can see, DMs, you can do different polls and interactive stickers in your stories, where you can en masse get information. You can ask people a question and see what hundreds of people at once say in response. I think it allows more, because it's such a rich platform with so many different ways of posting, you can have much more interactions. That's what I like about it. I also like that most people use Instagram more personally. So that means that if you do make something that someone shares to their account, they're now sharing it with their personal network. And so even if you have a scientist sharing your work or your post, chances are a lot of their friends, some of them might be scientists too, but then they have family members and other people in their personal network. And so that's a really nice way to reach new audiences, using a platform that people use in a personal way. Facebook too. A lot of people have their high school friends on Facebook. So it's kind of nice. Of course, there's this shift in which generation uses Facebook more, but it's more personal connections on Facebook. So that means that you can reach people's personal networks, which can be really great. Compared to Twitter, where people use it more professionally, and same with LinkedIn. It's a little more echo chambery, which if that's your target, that's great. But if you want to reach those new audiences, thinking about the audiences you want to reach and where they are, and where your connections are connected to those audiences, I think is a really good strategy.
And so now we're going to start asking some of the questions that we received from our audience throughout the discussion. And the first question is from Paul. How does a non-scientist find out the consensus on a particular topic?
Yeah, I think going to journalists that you trust and like newspapers, for example, you trust, New York Times, for example, and seeing what they've written about it, because the journalists would have done a lot of the heavy lifting for you, is a really good place to start. And another good place to start is a lot of if you think of like neuroscience, which is my field, there's a society for neuroscience. There's a lot of, we have many professional societies, and you can ask someone if you have access to a scientist in that field, if they can link you to that society's website, or you can kind of try to look it up, like Society for Neuroscience, Society for Stem Cell Research. It'll take you to the society's website, and often they'll have blogs that they're writing for everyone to read, and then less technical language, and that could be a good place to find more evergreen content, and that would lead you to, so they'll have information if it's a topic pertaining to neuroscience on like, can the brain change itself? Like all of these really popular topics you might be wondering about, chances are there's a blog post on that society's website. And to me, I think that's a decent place to start to find consensus on a topic of interest.
Yeah, professional societies and associations will often have statements on their sites. So about certain issues, they will say, here's what the consensus shows. And if you're looking also for good reviews of certain topics, not necessarily the scientific consensus per se, but something that is very close to that, the Cochrane collaboration on health issues has produced some amazing, fairly thorough systematic reviews on these topics. The only asterisk I would say is that very often, because they do so from an evidence-based perspective and not a science-based perspective, they might do a review of energy healing and say, we haven't found any evidence that it works. More research is needed. I would say more research is probably not needed because the prior plausibility is so low. But other than that, the conclusions that they come to tend to be a very, very high quality. So yes, professional societies, associations, they often have statements. They often talk to the public, and Cochrane collaboration reviews tend to be very, very good.
Another question that someone might ask is similar, not scientific consensus, but if a claim is being made in conjunction with a specific health product or a health service provided by a regulated professional, the question you might be asking is this appropriate for the claim? Is it legal? Is it authorized? If it's a regulated health product, of course, your resource is Health Canada. You can go onto the website. There are different databases for the authorizations that they provided for different products and the types of claims that can be made. Of course, you can always just contact them if you're not clear whether something is authorized. I've done that in the past. Usually they're relatively efficient in getting back. Your other option, of course, is when you're dealing with health professionals who are making a claim, and you can get in touch with their regulatory authority, and you may or may not get information in this case, depending on the regulatory authority. Unfortunately, some are pretty forthcoming, and they'll say, well, not only is this inappropriate, but we're going to launch an investigation. And then others will say, we're not going to comment. If you want to make a complaint, go ahead. Unfortunately, that's the reality of our regulatory system. But those are your two approaches for determining the kind of legality or legitimacy of a claim within our health regulatory framework.
You can also send me a DM on Instagram, because this is actually why I exist online, is to connect people with resources. So if you have like a really specific question, and you can message it to me simply, I will do my best to connect you with someone who can tell you the consensus. That's what I'm passionate about doing. So I'm here for you.
And so our next question was from Robin, who wanted to know, after 13 years, what does the panel see as the outcome of homeopathy being regulated in Ontario?
I'll start this one. It'll be interesting to see if we have disagreements here. I don't think that they should be a regulated profession. So that's my position. I don't see how you could possibly regulate a profession that is, especially permitting them self-regulation when they're based on nonsense. The unfortunate problem that we have is if we deregulate them, as I mentioned earlier, one of the huge gaps we have in our regulatory system is, um, protecting the public from practitioners who don't belong to a regulatory college. So I think right now policymakers kind of see it as it's better than nothing. But really, my opinion is the alternative should be a robust um, authority that goes after unregulated practitioners who are um, practicing essentially medicine on patients without any license or without belonging to a regulated college. Because, I mean, right now, if you were just to disband their college, I don't think that all of those homeopaths would just stop practicing. I think what would happen is they would continue just doing the same thing, and there would be even less oversight. So ultimately, I don't think they should be regulated, but I think we need to address other concerns before deregulating.
Yeah, and the issue is that many, in my field of stem cell biology, many clinics providing unauthorized stem cell procedures will create their own fake governing bodies. And so they'll make their own fake certifications and like boards that they've received that are either not relevant, or they'll use real ones that aren't actually relevant, or they'll make their own. And so it becomes such a challenge because if it's completely unregulated, they'll make their own, and it's really hard to, I don't know everything about regulatory affairs in Canada or elsewhere. And so I could be fooled easily as to what's an actual regulatory body and an actual certification and what isn't. So that's what really, where it gets messy. You almost need like a website listing all of the approved medical practitioners in the country or something, or at least the governing bodies for them, but that's not a great solution.
Yeah, unfortunately, we just don't have the national level of collaboration there. It's all, each province is doing their own thing. Some professions are regulated in some provinces and not regulated in other provinces. And I definitely get you with the deceptive use of the like internal labels and associations. I've seen a case where a college registered a trademark that I think it was tied to their diploma, where they trademarked the term certified into the full name of the practitioner's title. Yes. So even not being like certified to do anything, they called themselves certified practitioners. It was just but meaningless.
Yeah, that's where it gets really messy. Even when I was recommending earlier to try to find the professional society, I was also like, oh, but there are so many fake ones now that it's I don't know.
Jonathan, do you want to chime in?
I mean, I agree with what Ryan says. I think that I suspect that in a perfect world, we would need a science-based national
science police.
Yes, exactly. Trademark, right? But we would need some kind of a science-based national body to regulate all the health professions in the same way across the board, no pun intended. And the problem with homeopaths, I mean, for people who are watching this who don't know what homeopathy is, who think that it's just herbs, it's not. It's this old idea, that a German doctor made up once at some point. The more you dilute a substance, the stronger it becomes. There are all these weird laws that make absolutely no scientific sense. It is essentially pre-scientific. So when you're buying homeopathy in the pharmacy, you're buying a sugar pill. Like literally, that's all there is. It's just a sugar pill. When you give homeopaths a professional body governing them, to the average person, I suspect it means, oh, they've earned this. There's a governmental seal of approval. It gives them a patina of legitimacy, and that can be quite dangerous, because once you have that legitimacy, Ryan can talk to you for hours and hours about what's happening with chiropractors in Ontario. You regulate yourself, and so if you think that all of your life energy goes through your spine and you can correct any kind of illness by cracking the spine, And if somebody like Ryan complains and says, well, that's not accurate, I mean, if that's what your belief is, and you're in charge of that governing body, you just say, well, too bad, buddy, because that's what we believe in. So these kinds of regulatory bodies for unscientific professions, unfortunately, what they end up doing is they give legitimacy to the profession, and they make it harder to lodge complaints, because if you believe in nonsense and you're at the top, I mean, what are you going to do with a genuine science-based query?
I will just say I don't think all of these things need to be solely rooted in science. Like the world operates on more than science, but and that's where these guys have power, in that they do give people the comfort and compassion that they're not going to get from their GP. Quite frankly, I find most of my interactions with MDs to be really crappy and cold, and I think many people share that experience. So that's the problem, is it couldn't be a scientific. It couldn't be a governing body that's only evaluating them for their science ability, because then we'll end up with the same kind of crappy practitioners that we had. Not to say that they're all bad, but we'll end up with the same problems, in my opinion. So that's where it becomes hard, is how do you create that governing body that dictates who is legit and who isn't? It needs to be rooted in more than science. It needs to be rooted in other guiding principles, and then it becomes a challenge. And so, and again, if you just don't give them any regulations, they'll make up their own, and you get to the same end. So that's where I'm skeptical about regulation, I guess. That's where I see it as, I don't know if it's the helpful way forward.
Yeah, so that's where we kind of generally take the position of, we don't want to prevent anyone from getting certain services or going to, practitioners that they like. We want just, honesty in advertising, make claims up to what the science will allow. I don't think most people go to massage therapists for specific scientific claims that are being made. So it's not a service where it's reliant on very specific clinical, evidence that is touted in advertising, and yet, the profession continues to exist. In my own activism, I've actually had little engagement with the massage profession. They seem to not be really troublemakers too much.
That's actually a great counterpoint and a great example. So yeah, you've convinced me.
All right, we're on board. Science police.
No, yeah. It's almost as if the governing body should be integrity-based an advertisement governing body. Really, just not looking to the validity of what you're advertising.
Yeah, what's also complicated there is we do actually have separate laws that govern advertising in the marketplace, and we do have ad standards, which is a kind of voluntary regulator, and there's also the Competition Bureau, which is a legitimate regulatory agency. I think they're a branch of law enforcement technically. I maybe have to look that up, but again, another difficulty with the various health professions is that they're very hands-off with them, right? Because they recognize that health professionals have their own governing bodies, and they control that marketplace. So there are also separate laws that do govern Canadians and the market broadly, and in theory should be cracking down on false claims, but they kind of stay out of health for the most part.
This next question is from Jean-Michel, who asked, would you agree that scientists, academics, and experts in various industries do not get involved enough publicly to debunk the myths and pseudoscience in their fields?
Yeah, that is a problem. One of the issues is that it's not really rewarded by universities. I think that is slowly changing. But certainly, if you're a professor who's looking for tenure, the fact that you're communicating to the public does not weigh very much in your CV. I mean, the university wants you to bring in grants. They want you to be supervising a lot of students. They want good publications in high impact journals. But unfortunately, science communication has kind of not been really rewarded by universities in the past. And so why would professors who are already overwhelmed with work, why would they add that to their workload? And then the other thing is that a lot of scientists are just not trained to do this properly. Having had to endure so many professors in grad school giving lectures about the topic that they're experts in, I can tell you that they are not very good on average at explaining things and making them interesting and even entertaining, dare I say. So it's not a skill set that you're taught as a scientist. And that's a shame, because it is so important. I mean, when you think about this, if you're a researcher and you have to write a grant proposal, what is that? It's you're selling yourself. Or you have to sell your ideas. You have to sell the reason why you're doing this. So you would think that we would train scientists to do that, but we rarely do. So I think that's why. So it tends not to be rewarded by universities. And even if you choose to do it, many scientists are not very good at it because of a lack of training. So that's quite challenging.
And those things are so I 1,000% echo what you just said. Like, those are so linked. There's no training for science communication because people don't value science communication. People think, you'll just do it or whatever. Or we think that because we can sell something in a grant, we would be good at speaking broadly on our topic. But it's not true, because if you look at the selling rhetoric in a grant or even in a paper, it's so broad. Like, people just get lazy. Instead of thinking, why does my research, why does understanding lineages of stem cells in the early developing brain, why is that important? People will just jump to what they think is sexy. They'll just say, like, oh, because then we can regenerate the brain after stroke. That's the lazy answer, but that's not why I'm actually doing that research. The reason I'm doing it is because we have no idea how you create the diversity of cells in the brain, and that's fascinating. How do you go from 1 to trillions of cells in the body? That's what we're trying to answer. So we kind of just get lazy and give what we think people want to hear, instead of working on reframing the nuanced, interesting part of our research into a way that anyone can connect with. And it can be done, but we get so lazy. We don't have the resources, we don't have the training, and it's because that whole field is not valued. And it's such a problem. So I don't think that every scientist should communicate on their work, because I think that's where you run it. With COVID-19, people are communicating on it with no communication training or crisis communication training, and they're really screwing it up. Every scientist who makes a new computer simulation about how aerosols travel is tweeting about it. And it's like, can you not? Because it really matters how you communicate something that has that big of an impact. And so I think in many cases, communication on science should be done by people with either training or acquired experience. I don't have any science communication training, but I have a lot of practice and experience, and I read up personally informal training. And so I think it should be left to those people who really have taken time to think about the impact that certain words have when they're used, and the impact it'll have on their audiences. And if you're not doing all of that work, like, science communication is a science in itself. And if you're not respecting that about it, then you shouldn't be doing it, because you're actually doing the thing that you're also fighting. You're contributing to misinformation by being someone who's participating in the science of communication, without having read up on it. And that is such a big problem. And people will get mad. They'll say, oh, you're a biologist. Why are you going on the radio to talk about physics? And it's because I can learn enough about physics to talk about it. I can know who to check as a source, but I'm trained on how to talk about things in a way that not only makes sense, but is not going to have a rippling negative effect. And I think that's something that we don't value enough, and is obviously I'm very passionate about it, and I want to see it changed.
Yeah, and an example of what you bring up of how sort of a naive scientist could really screw things up is with vaccination, right? So it would be very easy for a scientist who is pro-vaccine to suddenly look at anti-vaxxers online and that kind of rhetoric, and to just go in and qualify them as idiots, and this is stupid, blah blah blah.
I hate that word. Yeah.
Right, because and I've seen memes of, like, what is they show like a medieval thing with bodies in it. What is that? Oh, it's an anti-vaxxer bus or whatever it was. But the point is that the point is that when you learn about the vaccine hesitancy that people have, which is that it is a spectrum. It's not just you've got people who are pro-vaccine, people who are anti-vaccine. There are a lot of people in the middle who are hesitant to vaccinate. And when they hear the rhetoric from scientists saying, oh, anti-vaxxers are stupid, they think to themselves, well, they're not hearing me. They're not hearing my concerns. why should I listen to them? I'm going to go with the anti-vaxxers because they're very welcoming, and they will validate my emotions and all that kind of stuff. So indeed, when you don't know what you're doing, you can actually make things worse.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And time and time again, even just in this year alone, we've seen this happening over and over again. And so scientists watching, get some training on how to talk about your field, reach out to even the people in this panel or people who do science communication training. There are tons of people across the country and across the world who do science communication training, and it's just so important. And start including it in your budget lines when you're making your grants. Make like hiring a graphic designer or getting a subscription to BioRender to help you make graphics. Put that as a budget line item and start forcing people to value it. If you can do it starting from again, I really believe in grassroots movements, and I think individuals can make a difference if you can start making it be valued by saying it's valued, attributing a value to it in your grants and other things that you work on.
Well, I'll chime in to say I absolutely agree with the others. There are definitely investments that we should be making, into the training and into the time that scientists have to get involved, beyond their little bubble, break down the barrier to the ivory tower and so on. I think there may be also broader institutional efforts that could be made. I mean, this requires a lot more thinking. Is probably way outside of the scope of this conversation, but I mean, science is very detached as an institution from regular people, and it's our approach right now is to kind of poke holes into that barrier with scientists coming out to get involved in social media and disseminate what they're doing to the public. But my question is, maybe there are other ways that science can be fundamentally altered as an institution, at least in some respects, to make it more approachable to the public and to involve the public more. Maybe there are certain aspects that need to be democratized more than nothing right now, because someone who is completely outside of academic institutions of any types of scientific research, from their perspective, you have a group of scientists who they don't know, who aren't involved in any social media, who typically, a group of older men making, decisions about granting that are largely unavailable to the public. So, this is public money that is not that transparent always. And I mean, I think it is a really reliable mechanism how we do perform granting to fund the types of science that we want to pursue. And how those scientists are chosen. Getting really deep into the weeds here, but I think there are possibilities for expanding our institutions and our models, and looking at democratization and maybe citizen science, and that's something we kind of dabble a little bit in at Bad Science Watch. We perform studies where we kind of collaboratively come up with methodology, and then we engage in volunteers to get together and run those studies. And that's very different than what typically happens in academia, which really is behind closed doors and until it's published. So I think there are, in addition to training scientists to do this battle, there may be ways we can change science, again, as an institution, not the methodology so much, to just be more available to people and more present in everyone's life.
If I can tack on 2 quick points, if that's okay, Jen, to that. I think, the UK is a little bit more advanced in the way that they do their science engagement and science communication. They value it a little bit more. They have more institutional support for it. And one of the really cool things that happens, I don't know if this is widespread or if it's certain funding agencies that mandate this, but they have something called patient involvement. And so if you are a researcher that's studying a particular disease, for example, it is mandatory for you to have someone with that disease, or like your core stakeholder, the patients with that disease, be involved and even come to lab meetings. And so they are involved at many stages of the research progress. That way we're actually doing what you said, like integrating a little bit better. But the other, and so I think that should happen everywhere. I think if you're studying anything, people, your key stakeholders, people who that research affects, they should be involved at many stages of the research process, not just the end when you go and give a talk because your granting agency makes you. From the beginning in developing the research questions, I think those stakeholders need to be involved. But the second thing is that, we've been saying the public, singular, it's really the publics, it's people, it's a diversity of people that exist in society that we need to be reaching. And the way that we do that is through a diversity of communication strategies and a diversity of communicators. Historically, we suck at that. Historically, if you look at the famous scientists and skeptics, like they're all kind of the same. And what I want to see us doing more of, to do more than poke holes, is again, science communication by and for specific communities. We need science communicators who are queer and trans and people of color and disabled and indigenous. And we need to really, that is what we lack so hard. And by having that, that's how you're going to actually integrate with more communities and get more people involved. Small bit of evidence for that is that we ran an event called Science is a Drag, where we had scientists who are queer and trans up on stage in drag explaining their science. And in doing that event, the majority of people in our audience were people who had never come to a science event. And they just came because it was a drag event. And things like that, where you're communicating in science in a way that is meaningful to the communities you're trying to reach, that's how you do more than poke holes and make people feel comfortable and involve them, in my experience.
This next question is from Sarah, who asked, how do we address pseudoscience when it's based in the traditions from cultures that have been historically marginalized?
Yeah, I think this is where we need to realize that what I was trying to allude to this earlier, like science isn't the only thing that matters. I think science has really colonial roots, right? And it's a very Eurocentric approach to finding information. And I think that's really uncomfortable for a lot of scientists to admit, because we like to think that we are so objective and wonderful and perfect at doing things. But the history of science as it's practiced most popularly today, again, has those Eurocentric colonial roots. And so many ways of knowing have been completely dismissed and kicked out of science as we discuss it. And I think we need to really be paying attention to that and realize that, there are, for example, indigenous ways of knowing, and there's different cultures have their own ways of knowing and things that they've acquired, not through our scientific tools. They have their own tools for finding information. And we need to start involving those people so that we can now let our scientific framework encompass many frameworks of knowing things. We can't just be saying, we need to acknowledge that they have different ways of assessing what works and what doesn't, and we need to bring them aboard in positions of power so that they can teach us how they learn stuff, and we can share with them how we learn stuff, and we can learn from one another and expand science. I think scientists are really, really bad about dismissing other cultural ways of knowing, because we think that they're nonsense, but really it's just that we've defined science in a certain way that has historically excluded them, and that's a big issue. I think Canada's trying to make amends with that with our Indigenous communities, but we're not doing it enough, and I would love to see more Indigenous researchers and thought leaders having positions of power at universities where they can actually get a platform for their work and their knowledge.
Are you saying not to dismiss their findings, but to take their knowledge and run it through a sort of a scientific research program? Or
no, I'm saying they might even have, the scientific method is one way of knowing, and there can be other ways of testing and understanding things that have been historically passed down. And I think we need to, I'm not an expert in those other ways. So what I would like to see us doing is taking those people who are experts, elders in different communities, listening to what they know and how they know it, and giving them funding to keep pursuing research in their way and working more collaboratively, instead of saying, I'm going to take your thing and I'm going to test it in my way because my way is the only way to test it. This is where we run into issues. But the scientific method was very much made with one type of cultural mindset. This is, I know, a well, many people will disagree with me on this, and I'm okay with.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree, but I also don't know enough to have a strong opinion, so I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I am echoing what I've heard Indigenous leaders say. So this is I should give them credit that this is what they're asking to be included. And so I'm not going to claim that this is my original idea, but this is what I've heard some folks say, and I think it's something that we should definitely listen to and explore.
I think definitely as an institution, science has always had serious blind spots. I think people think of it as kind of a linear progression to understanding the world. Um, whereas there are ideologies and ethical frameworks that underpin our pursuits, in how we decide what to pursue and how to pursue um, certain research topics. And those things tend not to get questioned so much when you have, a select group of people. Science it has always been somewhat of a hierarchy. It at least I think tends to be more of a hierarchy of expertise than a lot of other hierarchies that exist in the world. But even so, nothing's perfect. And those people make up a not very diverse set of people who are determining the course of science, essentially. And as a result, there may be again, blind spots and ideologies that are impacting and preventing science from having the most benefit to the public at large. And of course, some of the classic examples come from, I guess, the 60s and 70s, and a lot of more early clinical research where research was performed on not very diverse subject bases, and it was just kind of assumed that you could extrapolate. Still, sorry. Still going on, yes.
Well, the NIH mandates now that you need to have, things have changed since the early 90s. I know it's not perfect, but it's changed a little bit. No, I do agree that, the way in which we do science is flawed. That's kind of something that I've been saying since I started doing science communication. I would want us to be careful that we don't fall into relativism, into saying that any way of knowing that has a tradition behind it is just as valid as a scientific way of knowing, because then we run into the same kind of issue of like people saying, well, I've taken essential oils and I haven't had the flu in years and years. But anecdotes are not a very good way of knowing about things. So I would just want to make sure we're careful about not falling into relativism.
Yeah, definitely. I think the problem with let's use goop as an example because it's an easy example. The problem with that is that basically goop is culturally appropriating all of these traditional products and healing agents. They're culturally appropriating, they're stealing them, taking them out of context and overselling them, and they have none of the actual context for how they might traditionally be used. Some products are completely made up, but a lot of things on goop are actually stolen from other cultures but used out of context. And so I think we need to be still careful to go to the right expert source in looking at those things, but realizing that those experts, they have some logic and premise beyond anecdote. I shouldn't, I can't give more concrete examples because I'm still trying to learn about this myself. I'm trying to unlearn the very strong academic science bias that I have, being someone who did education through that system. But it definitely seems valid to me, given knowing the exclusionary history of science. Yeah, there must be other ways of testing that we haven't considered that other groups have been doing for centuries. And maybe we should, listen to them since they're asking to be heard.
I think we can all agree goop bad.
Goop, amazing marketing, but bad.
Well, thank you all for joining this discussion. This was such a great conversation. To everyone who tuned in, this is going to be published at a later date on our podcast. Just so you know, we're doing another virtual conference that's going to be free in 2 weeks, which I'm really excited about, featuring Dr. Kevin Folta and Dr. Rennie Van Acker from the University of Florida and the University of Guelph, and we're going to be talking about sustainability in agriculture. So if you would like to join in that conversation, then head on over to the same page that you bought or purchased your free ticket for this event. And it's going to be published by probably on Saturday, so get yourself a ticket so you can join in on that live stream. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and I hope you all have a great rest of your night.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, thanks for having us, Jen.
Thanks.
I hope James turned off the live stream. Thank you guys, that was great.
Thank you once
Yeah,
again for the
thank you.
invitation, and thanks for adapting to the new situation. Because we
Yeah.
were supposed to be in Toronto today.
Yeah. New, but I mean, I should do more of these because you can reach so